Government spending since COVID-19 has shot to the heavens, not just in Ontario, but everywhere. And it's worth noting, people are not complaining about debt and deficits as they once did. That begs the question, do deficits actually matter anymore? Well, let's get into that. With us now in East Setauket, New York, on the North Shore of Long Island, Stephanie Kelton, professor of economics and public policy at Stony Brook University, and she's the author of The Deficit Myth, Modern Monetary Theory and the Birth of the People's Economy. In Montreal, Quebec, Chris Reagan. He's director of McGill University's Max Bell School of Public Policy. And in the nation's capital, economist Armin Yalnizyan, the Atkinson Fellow on the Future of Workers, and a columnist for the Toronto Star with unquestionably the best LP collection anywhere in the world. And we are delighted to welcome Chris and Armin back to our program. Stephanie, for the first time, nice to have you along as well. Let's start with a quote here from the Wall Street Journal to get us started. Sheldon, if you would, let's bring this graphic up. The pandemic has pushed global government debt to the highest level since World War II, surpassing the world's annual economic output. Governments, especially in rich countries, are borrowing still more, partly to erase the damage of COVID-19. Advocates say the spending, also encouraged by new economic thinking about debt, could usher in a period of robust global growth, reversing the malaise many wealthy countries have felt this century. But if those theories are off base, the world could be saddled with debts that can be absorbed only via inflation, high taxes, or even default. Okay, let's start there. Stephanie, to what extent has this pandemic changed the way we think about debts and deficits?
Well, I think early on, it changed the way we think quite dramatically, right? We had obviously a crisis hit. And unlike what happened after the previous crisis, and I'm referring to the sort of 2007, 2008 financial crisis, okay, Congress responded, governments around the world responded to that crisis as well. But what we got here in the US in terms of a response was really kind of one and done. We got one medium-sized fiscal package, and then Congress basically washed its hands of the whole thing and went AWOL and left the job to the Federal Reserve to try to restore the jobs and the economic growth that, had been left behind. This time was different. This time with COVID, we got a very sizable response in March of last year. Here we got $2.2 trillion. And then Congress came back in December and did another $900 billion. And then this March, Congress came back and did $1.9 trillion. None of it with all of the usual hand-wringing about the deficit and how to pay for spending. So at least in the first 18 months or so of the pandemic, we had a very different response, not just here in the US, but of course across Europe and there in Canada as well. Much more robust, much less concern for the budgetary impacts. And I think the evidence now is that the U.S. experienced the shortest recession in our nation's history as a result of that robust fiscal support.
Okay, Chris Reagan, same question to you. How much has this pandemic made us rethink what we used to think about debts and deficits?
Well, I guess I would say that, I'm largely in favor of what the Canadian federal government did in terms of fiscal policy. I think we were hit with an enormous and a very unusual shock. And I think there was a very real need for providing very significant financial relief to households and businesses. And we did it. They did it very quickly. They did it at scale. And I think the government should be commended for that. But I also think that the last 2 years, or 32 years for that matter, hasn't changed some basic truths about fiscal policy. And I think it is still true, and always was true, that every time the government spends money, you either finance it with taxes or you finance it with borrowing. And on the borrowing side, you can either borrow it from the private markets or you can borrow it from your friendly central bank down the street. And all of those approaches to financing have both pros and cons. So every time you raise taxes, there are pros and cons. Every time you borrow from private markets, there are pros and cons. And every time you print money to borrow from your central bank, there are pros and cons. And so the best mix of taxes and private borrowing and printing money, I think, depends very much on time and place. And there's not a single best policy for all times and all places. But I absolutely agree that the last 18 months has been a fundamentally different shock, and it's caused for it's called for very creative fiscal policy, and we've done it.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty obvious if you look at pretty much every country in the world today. They've all said, to hell with deficits. We're going to spend whatever it takes in order to protect people from the ravages of this coronavirus. But do you believe Chris is right that at the end of the day, there are some basics that are true regardless of what time period we are in history, and they need to be obeyed?
I think I'm going to go back to your original question, which is, do we think about deficits fundamentally different now because of the pandemic? And I'll see your question and I'll raise you one. I think we look at money fundamentally differently. Stephanie mentioned that started in the wake of the global financial crisis, where central banks around the world marshaled resources to save the financial system from paralysis, to keep the liquidity going. And suddenly we found that there were gajillions of dollars available to protect the most large financial institutions. So money was available to socialize risk, but not to socialize profits. That remained in private hands. Around the same time, when the global financial crisis came, we started seeing the birth of cryptocurrencies that had moved from dark markets, basically gangsters using ways of exchanging things, to mainstreaming it. Bitcoin was introduced in 2009, I think in January, right in the heart of the recession. And as of today, I just checked before we came online, there are 13,000 cryptocurrencies in circulation right now. Bitcoin still has the biggest market share, but it was only 7,000 cryptocurrencies at the end of September. And the reason I'm raising this is because what is money and who produces it has been raised in question. China clamped down on digital currencies because it wants to issue its own. And of course, all central banks are looking at who issues sovereign currency. And then the third issue is the pandemic, where we realized that, first of all, we haven't seen this kind of government reaction because this isn't a demand shortfall. It is supply stoppage to contain the contagion, which hasn't ended yet. And there is absolutely nothing in our playbook on how you deal with supply-based shocks, which I think we're going to see more of, whether it's pandemics or more extreme climate moments. But without governments stepping into the breach, we are going to see total collapse of whole economies. So what this has done is ask us, what is money and what are governments for? I think it's a very profound question, and it doesn't end at what are deficits, though that's one of the manifestations of what are governments for and who are they for. That's the moment we are in.
I appreciate your point, and I guess let me just pivot. Boy, there's that word again. Let me just pivot over to Stephanie with this, because I think we're all old enough to remember the early 1980s with Reaganomics and a completely different from today view of how you ought to handle money. It was deregulation. It was let the free markets bloom. It was get the government out of your face. Is that era, in your view, Stephanie, I mean, is that history now?
Not necessarily, but don't forget that part of what Reagan did also were massive tax cuts and an enormous buildup in the military budget. That produced increases in the deficit and a near tripling of the national debt. So this conversation that we've been having about, deficits and whether and how they matter, remember that it was Dick Cheney, Vice President Cheney, who famously quipped that Reagan had proved that deficits don't matter, at least not the way that we've been taught to think of them. So, there will always be a strong group, a strong presence of politicians here in the US and elsewhere who believe that the way to generate economic growth and prosperity is mostly through the free market, through deregulating markets, through tax cuts, through getting government out of the way and incentivizing the private sector. And that is sort of the rhetoric that gave us the so-called trickle-down economic theories that, have been implemented and tried for the better part of 4 decades now. And I think if your question is, are we seeing a shift away from that? I think the jury is in some sense still out. We are attempting to do that here under the Biden administration. But as you're undoubtedly aware, up there in Canada, we're having some trouble passing that kind of legislation. So we have competing ideologies when it comes to how to grow an economy.
When you just said that, everybody else smiled because, yes, we have been aware that there have been some difficulties down in D.C. on that issue. But okay, that was 40 years ago. Let me take you, Chris, to 25 years ago, 26. Paul Martin, then the finance minister, brings in what the Globe and Mail called the mother of all austerity budgets. And he said at the time, the debt and deficit are not inventions of ideology, they are facts of arithmetic. The quicksand of compound interest is real. Is that some of the sort of basic arithmetic that you tried to tell us about in your previous answer?
Well, yeah, I think it's hard to disagree with some of the arithmetic. I mean, you can look back and you can still have a debate about whether Paul Martin and Jean Chrétien should have embarked on the fiscal consolidation that they did starting in 1995. I mean, my own view is that, in fact, debt, so federal plus provincial debt in this country had reached 90% of GDP. The private markets had started questioning how we were going to pay it back, or when we were going to pay it back, or whether we were going to pay it back. Bond yields started spiking. The government then decided that they needed to actually consolidate, basically mostly cut spending, a little bit of tax increases, but deficits that were pretty substantial as a share of GDP turned into surpluses within a few years, and our debt to GDP ratio fell. And I would say, and I think that was actually mostly good policy. And in fact, one of the legacies of Paul Martin's actions that started in the mid-1990s was that by the time we got to the global financial crisis in 2008, and what was also true at the beginning of COVID in 2020, is that the federal government's debt to GDP ratio was low. It was 30 or 31% of GDP. And that gave us the ability in both of those situations to be very aggressive in terms of designing a fiscal policy response. In 2009 and 10, it was a fiscal stimulus package that was 3 or 4% of GDP. And of course, with COVID, it was the provision of financial relief that ended up being 15 or 16% of GDP. And I think that would have been harder to do if our books had been in less good position.
All right, but Armin, I do want to circle back to this with you, and I take your larger point about what is government for. That is a profoundly important and interesting question. But I'm going to get back to the math again. I mean, is math? Are there basic arithmetic realities here that those who run deficits in the order of $365 billion annually will simply have to deal with at some point?
You know, this reminds me of the minimum wage conversation and whether raising the minimum wage is going to kill jobs. And the evidence when it comes to GDP or deficits is that Japan can run over 200% of GDP. It is not a failed state. Chad can run 15% of GDP. It is a failed state. There is no magic number of where debt to GDP is the right number. What matters is how you're using the money you're borrowing and whether it is creating something of value that raises up people's quality of life. And if you are doing that, if you are actually maximizing potential, not just in terms of GDP growth, but quality of life growth, then you are, whatever it is you're doing, you can afford to do because it pays itself, it pays for itself at some level. Because if you don't do it, you're actually minimizing your ability to maximize your output. So I'm not sure that the math question is the right question. It's like, what are you doing with the money? It's that old Mae West line. It ain't how big it is, it's how you use it, right? Like, what are you doing with the money that you're borrowing?
You are a really different kind of economist, I got to say, which is why we keep having you back on this program. That was great. Okay, I want to
say something.
Yeah, sure, please, Stephanie. Yes, please.
So, Armin, it is. So I love this. It's not the size of the debt that matters, but I'll differ slightly. I'll say it's the denomination, right? Yeah. That is what is so critical here. Our debt here in the U.S. is denominated in U.S. dollars. Canada's debt is denominated in the Canadian dollar. Japan's is denominated in the Japanese yen. You go to a country like Greece or Italy, now you have debt that's denominated in the euro, right? Because these countries gave up their sovereign currencies many years ago, and they began borrowing in currencies that they can't issue. It's like what happens in Venezuela or Argentina. You start taking on foreign denominated debt, and it's a game changer because now you're pledging to pay back debt in a currency that doesn't come from you. So is there default risk? Are you vulnerable in ways that Canada and the US aren't? You bet you are. You start borrowing in a foreign currency. So I think Armin's exactly right to point to Japan as the perfect example here. Here is a country that had a very robust response to COVID, not because it was frugal for the last 30 years and had kept its deficits small or kept its budget in surplus. No. Japan has been running fiscal deficits for 3 decades, large deficits, and basically the largest debt to GDP ratio in the world at some 240%. So it's not like they were scraping by and all of a sudden had the money to unleash in response to COVID. They were able to do that because they're a currency issuing government like the US, like Canada. And the reason that things were different this time in Italy and in places like Greece is because the European Central Bank stepped up early, didn't wait like it did after the debt crisis in 2010. It stepped up early and it backstopped these governments. And it said, listen, we know you can't issue the currency, but we have your back. We will hold interest rates down. We will buy bonds. We will support you. Go spend the money you need to spend, fight the pandemic, support your economies, and we have your back. Okay, so it's sort of like, Congress supporting individual states here in the US. We have to treat individual states, governors and mayors differently. They don't have currency issuing capacity, and the ECB has to treat member governments differently because they've given up their currency issuing capacity.
Okay, while you've got the floor, I would like to read an excerpt from your book, The Deficit Myth, which just coincidentally is on the shelf right there over your right shoulder. And here comes the excerpt. The taxpayer, according to the conventional view, is at the center of the monetary universe because of the belief that the government has no money of its own. Therefore, the only money available to fund the government must ultimately come from people like us. MMT, modern monetary theory, radically changes our understanding by recognizing that it is the currency issuer, the federal government itself, not the taxpayer, that finances all government expenditures. The idea that taxes pay for what the government spends is pure fantasy. Okay, let's get into some conversation here about MMT, modern monetary theory. Stephanie, you want to start and give us your sort of best handy-dandy definition of that?
All right, so MMT, it's got the word theory in there. Don't let that confuse you. It's a little bit of a branding problem in a sense, because MMT is really a description of the monetary system that exists today and the mechanics of government finance. So what we're trying to do is explain honestly, candidly, how does a monetary system work and how does government finance work under the system we have today, which is not a gold standard system. So back in the day, the US dollar was tied to gold. We had an international monetary system where we had fixed exchange rates. We had a different system and things worked differently. After 1971, President Nixon took the US off the gold standard, and this old monetary system called the Bretton Woods system went away. Now we have what are called floating exchange rates, fiat currencies, and it matters. It changes everything. So when I say the taxpayer isn't at the center of the monetary universe, what I mean is that Congress can do what Congress has been doing for the last 18 months. Write a piece of legislation, commit trillions of dollars to providing support for the economy, fighting the pandemic, and so forth. And it can do that without having to go to the rest of us, hat in hand, to raise that money. It can commit to spending money that it does not have. How? Because Congress has the power of the purse. They write the bill, and if the votes are there, the money goes out. There is a system in place that involves private banks, that involves the central bank. The central bank works with the financial system to get that money into our accounts. If Congress authorizes the spending, the money goes out, and it is always accomplished through the creation of new money. So it always leads to new money creation that gets spent into the economy. Whether some of that money is subtracted away, unprinted, if you like, through taxation is a different question. But the point is that there can be no shortfall in spending capacity when you are the issuer of the currency.
Chris Reagan, come back at that if you like.
Well, I'll go back to what I said in my opening comment. So I haven't heard anything that has changed what my kind of three fundamental facts are, is that when the government spends money, they're either going to pay for their spending, which is their claim on resources, by using tax dollars, or they're going to borrow from private markets, or they're going to borrow from their central bank, which means printing money. Now, so all of those things are possible. All of those things are used all the time. The real debates are about the balance between those three things. So we can have a debate about, well, should we have higher taxes or not? We can have a debate about, should we borrow more from private markets or not? And we can have a debate about whether we should, print more money, or whether the central bank should print more money or not. And there are long and complex and interesting debates that go on into all three of those questions. And of course, there's the fourth question, which is, should we spend more or not? And if so, on what? So I don't think any of those things have changed, but you can certainly have a good debate about the relative weight you place on those different methods for financing. And what MMT is about, as I understand MMT, reading Stephanie's book and other things, that many things that are written in response to Stephanie's book, is that MMT takes the view that you can do a lot more of the financing with the central bank providing the financing. And you can worry about inflation, so we can come back and talk about inflation, and then you can use your taxing and spending as a way to control inflation. That's my very, perhaps, shoddy understanding of MMT in a nutshell, but we can get into that.
Stephanie, I know you want to come back on that, but hold off for a second, because we did in the province of Ontario just today have a fall economic statement, a kind of fiscal update on where the books of the province of Ontario are now. And Armin, I'd like you to comment on this, because the new deficit figure for this fiscal year in which we find ourselves, 2021-22, is now more than $20 billion, which is down a third from where they projected it, but it's more than $20 billion. My question for you is, what we've heard about modern monetary theory, would that apply to the provinces and the size of their deficits and borrowing, et cetera?
No.
So MMT.
No, this is for Armin. Sorry, let me hear from Armin on this, and then I'll come back to Stephanie.
No, because Ontario doesn't issue the Canadian dollar. It's not it isn't in charge of how much money is in the system. So municipalities aren't allowed to have debt because of the way our laws are organized, and provincially governments cannot take advantage of this theory. But if you've got a federal government that does have the provinces back, and that's what we've been seeing during this crisis, is the absolutely historic deal on early learning and childcare. Every single province, every jurisdiction is cash-strapped, and yet we need to do something about early learning and childcare if we're going to get a full recovery back and maximize the potential of all of our workforce, male and female, people with children and people without children. So something had to happen, and that was unilaterally federal funding, but not transfers to the provinces without strings attached, rather money that was sent to achieve certain goals that were taking place in a national framework but had provincial priorities and territorial priorities. So, the provinces don't benefit from MMT, but if you've got from an MMT approach, but if you've got a federal government that understands that it can underwrite nationwide strategies, then you can actually change the fiscal balance sheet of the provinces too.
Okay, Stephanie, apologies for the interruption. You wanted to say?
No, I agree with what Armin just said. I mean, what I want to make clear, and I think this is really important, is that one of the great strengths of MMT is the operational details, monetary operations, the mechanics of government finance. How does it really work? And so What MMT has shown, and I mean the scholarship, these are peer-reviewed academic publications where we lay this stuff out in very, great detail to explain that the government pays all of its bills only in one way. There isn't this menu of choices. The government can't sit back and say, well, should I use tax revenue to pay some of my bills? Should I borrow to pay some of my bills? Should I print money? It's presented as if there are these three choices that have to be made up front, and government can pick which way to pay the bills. That's not how it works at all. There's only one way that the government pays any of its bills, and that involves newly created money. So there isn't a menu of choices. What you have is, like I said before, Congress writes a bill, and that bill sends a set of instructions to the central bank. That's the government's fiscal agent. And so if Congress says we're going to send $1,400 checks to almost every person in this country, which we did, Congress is saying in that legislation to its bank, you're going to be crediting the bank accounts of the people who receive those checks and deposit them into their banks. You're going to mark up the size of the bank's account, and the bank is going to mark up the size of the recipient's account. That is new money creation. It's how it always works. Now, it's possible for Congress to write a bill that includes two sets of instructions. One set that says, go credit these bank accounts and dispense this money, and another set of instructions that says, go out and debit the bank accounts of the corporations and of the richest people in America, because we've decided to pay for, quote unquote, our spending by taxing the rich and taxing corporations. Now, the taxes aren't paying for the spending. It's two separate sets of instructions happening alongside one another. Some people get credits to their bank accounts, other people get debits to their bank accounts, and we pretend that the taxpayer, right, the rich, are shoving money over to the poor and to help build roads and bridges. That's not what's happening at all, but it's the way it's typically described.
So it sounds then, Chris, as if the nature of the relationship between central banks and governments is very different under this theory. Is that right?
I think it is, actually. So, the way I would describe how central banks and governments, federal governments, work in most countries is that there is an operational separation between them. So central banks are typically owned by their federal government, but they are typically operationally independent. And the federal government and the Treasury, sets taxes and sets spending and does borrowing into, issues debt into private markets. And the central bank, basically sets the amount of money in the system, and they do that by buying government bonds in secondary markets. But that monetary policy from the central bank and the fiscal policy from the federal government are typically, I don't want to say they're completely independent, but they are operationally independent. And the way I would think of MMT is that effectively you are subsuming the central bank and its independence, but also its actions into the federal government. Because now what you're doing is you're basically saying that the federal government is going to spend on whatever it wants to spend on, but it's going to print money effectively to do at least a large amount of that spending, probably a larger amount than it would have in the world where the two are operationally independent. And then you've got to figure out, kind of what is the division of duties in terms of trying to influence inflation. And, I would say that's the key thing. And so in the current world, the central bank is really keeping an eye on inflation and setting its actions largely to do that. And then you can have a debate about whether central banks do that well or whether they can modify their operations. But in the world of MMT, as I understand it, the federal government would adjust its taxes and spending so as to control inflation. And I guess my problem, I suppose, with MMT or with that approach is that I question whether taxes and spending is the best way to actually control inflation. I suspect that it is not, but we can talk about that.
Armin, do you have a view as to whether this way is a better way or is advisable to do?
I have to confess, I've read Stephanie's book. I have listened to so many of her podcasts, and I really do not understand the role of taxation in this whole story. So I don't want to weigh in because I don't really know what I'm talking about anymore.
All right. You want to give it a shot, Stephanie?
Let me back. Yes, my goodness. All right. So look, first of all, we cannot continue to pretend that MMT is about relying on central banks to provide financing for the government. It is not about that. It has never been about that. Go back to Ronald Reagan. MMT did not exist. There was no MMT. I wasn't even doing economics at the time. None of this stuff, MMT did not exist. But here's Ronald Reagan doing what? Exactly what we've been talking about, running large government deficits, tax cuts, big increases in defense spending, blowing out the deficit, nearly tripling the national debt. You didn't have quantitative easing happening alongside this, or even a friendly central bank. You had Paul Volcker. Interest rates were double-digit territory. And what happened? It all worked beautifully in the sense that every piece of legislation that Congress authorized, the central bank cleared the payments. They make the payments on behalf of the U.S. Treasury when they are authorized by Congress. That's how it worked under Reagan. That's how it worked under Bush. That's how it worked under Clinton and Obama and Trump, and now under Biden. So MMT is a description of the mechanics of government finance, how it works, not a proposal to have central banks monetize the debt or finance governments or any of the rest of it. So let's set all of that aside. Now, on the tax stuff, if Armin is confused about the role of taxes in MMT, let's address that because it's important. So what MMT recognizes is that taxes are not important as pay-fors, that they don't finance the government's spending, but they are important. They do important things. So what happens when the government taxes a dollar away from me? Every dollar that's taxed away from me is a dollar I don't have and therefore can't spend into the economy. So when Congress says, I want to spend trillions of dollars investing in infrastructure, rebuilding roads and bridges, doing child care and elder care, some free college and healthcare and all the rest of it, they can commit trillions and trillions of dollars and the payments will go out. Now, the question is, how long can Congress continue to simply spend money into the economy before it needs to worry about offsetting some of that spending with higher taxes or with cuts to other parts of the budget?
Forgive me. Let me jump in here because we're down to our last minute, and I'm going to let that rhetorical question exist in the ether while I ask Armin the last question here, which is, we clearly have been through a period of time right now to fight the coronavirus where deficits have not mattered at all. Are you concerned that we're about to move into a time of increasing fiscal restraint because of that?
Oh, gosh, Steve, talk about an easy question. I think it depends on who we vote for. And who we vote for depends on the beauty contest of ideas that is put in front of us as voters on what we say are the best ways to proceed together in the future. And I cannot guess what the rhetoric will be around whether a smaller government is a better thing or a bigger government is a better thing, or whether it's about size at all, as I said before, or rather our common purpose. So I don't know whether we are heading into another era of austerity, but it will be a case of competition of narratives. It will not be a technocratic discussion about where does the money come from. It'll be who wins your heart and mind with the pitch they put in front of you when it comes time to give somebody the power to make the decisions on our behalf.
I can't wait to see which politician quotes Mae West first. Stephanie Kelton from New York and Chris Reagan in Montreal, Armin Yalnizyan in the Big Smoke. It's great to have all of you on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
It was great.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.